Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from Natchez, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1846. Beneath the shadow of Natchez's grand mansions that crowned the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, a darkness flowed as steady and silent as the great river itself. On April 17th of that year, a small notice appeared in the back pages of the Natchez Courier. Nestled between advertisements for cotton seedlings and announcements of upcoming society gatherings was a brief item that would become the first thread in a tapestry of horror and secrecy spanning generations. Missing Mrs. Clara Wainwright, last seen departing Adams County Courthouse on April 17th. Any information regarding her whereabouts should be directed to Mr. Joseph Wainwright at Magnolia Estate. What seemed a routine disappearance notice would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing documented cases in Southern history, revealing a commerce that operated beneath the veneer of respectability, a trade not in cotton or sugar, but in human lives, thought to be beyond such exploitation in the American South of the 1840s. Natchez, Mississippi stood as a city divided, not just between the elegant homes atop the bluff and the rough-and-tumble district, known as Natchez under the Hill, but between the carefully maintained facade of Southern gentility and the brutal realities upon which much of its wealth was built. While the city's elite hosted lavish balls in mansions with names like Rosalie, Magnolia Hall, and Stanton Hall, the waterfront district served as a gateway for commerce, both legitimate and shadowed. Clara Wainwright had arrived in Natchez 4 years earlier, in the autumn of 1842, accompanying her husband Joseph Wainwright as he expanded his cotton brokerage business southward from Boston. The Wainwrights quickly established themselves among the city's commercial elite, though they occupied a curious position in Natchez society, neither fully embraced nor explicitly rejected by the established families whose roots in the region stretched back generations. Joseph Wainwright was regarded as a businessman of considerable acumen. Standing just under 6 feet tall, with a carefully maintained beard and penetrating gray eyes, he presented himself as a modern merchant, conversant in the evolving economics of international cotton trade and banking systems that were transforming commerce in the mid-19th century. His connections stretched from New Orleans to Boston, Liverpool to Le Havre, and his business operations expanded steadily during the 1840s, despite fluctuations in cotton prices that ruined less astute traders. Clara Wainwright presented a more enigmatic figure. Described in contemporary accounts as handsome rather than beautiful, with an intelligent expression and a directness of gaze uncommon among Southern ladies of the period, Clara was remembered for her Northern accent, apparent education, and unusual interest in matters typically considered beyond the feminine sphere. Augusta Connor, wife of a prominent Natchez physician, noted in her private letters that Mrs. Wainwright asks questions that sometimes border on impropriety. Though her manner is so composed, one hardly realizes the impertinence until the conversation has moved elsewhere. The Wainwright marriage appeared to outside observers to be one of partnership rather than passion. Joseph's business frequently took him away from Natchez for weeks at a time, to New Orleans, to Memphis, occasionally as far as Charleston or even Boston. During these absences, Clara maintained the household with quiet efficiency, making appropriate social calls, attending church at First Presbyterian, and generally fulfilling the expected duties of a merchant's wife. Yet there were whispers that her activities extended beyond the typical round of household management and social obligations. According to courthouse records from that period, meticulously maintained by Clerk Ambrose Merriweather and preserved in the Adams County archives until their mysterious disappearance in 1901, Clara had visited the Adams County Courthouse with increasing frequency in the months before her disappearance. Merriweather's personal ledger later discovered among his effects after his death in 1859, noted with some puzzlement the lady's interest in commercial records generally considered the domain of men. Mrs. W. again today reads an entry from March 1846, examining the Robertson shipping manifests and the Wilkinson property transfers. When asked about her interest, she spoke of assisting her husband with certain business matters during his absence in New Orleans. Most unusual. Another entry, dated April 10th, just a week before her disappearance, states, Mrs. Wainwright spent 3 hours reviewing the records of warehouse leases along the landing. Her knowledge of commercial matters is surprisingly extensive. She inquired particularly about properties changing hands since 1842 and about vessels regularly plying between here and New Orleans. I find myself wondering if her husband is aware of these investigations. The Wainwright household itself occupied a respectable but not ostentatious home on Washington Street, within comfortable walking distance of the commercial district, but removed from the noise and perceived unsavoriness of the riverfront. The house, a 2-story structure with a columned portico and small but well-maintained garden, was staffed by 4 household workers who kept the establishment running with apparent efficiency. Neighbors recalled little unusual about the household's daily operations, though several noted the frequency of evening callers, men associated with Joseph Wainwright's business interests, who would arrive after dark and depart before midnight. Sarah Jenkins, who worked in the Wainwright kitchen from 1843 until Clara's disappearance, later provided one of the few glimpses into the household's private operations. In a statement given to a Northern journalist in 1865, Jenkins recalled, Miss Clara, she wasn't like other ladies. She kept her own counsel, had a room upstairs where she would write for hours. Mr. Wainwright, he never went in there, not even when she was gone. She told me once, Sarah, if anything happens to me, remember the loose brick in the garden wall. I never knew what she meant by that, and after she disappeared I was too afraid to look. In the days following Clara's disappearance, the response from Natchez society was muted, concerningly so, as later observers would note. Joseph Wainwright informed authorities that his wife had mentioned visiting a friend, Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, who lived near the eastern edge of town but had never arrived. Mrs. Thornton, when questioned, expressed surprise, stating that no such visit had been planned. This discrepancy raised few eyebrows at the time. Constable James Harkins, responsible for law enforcement within Natchez city limits, organized a cursory search of the roads between the courthouse and the Thornton residence. No sign of Clara was found, no torn clothing, no personal items, no indication of struggle or misadventure. Harkins concluded, with what later evidence would suggest was suspicious haste, that Mrs. Wainwright had likely chosen to leave the city of her own accord, perhaps returning to her northern roots without informing her husband. Joseph Wainwright's response to his wife's disappearance struck some observers as curiously restrained. He placed the notice in the Natchez Courier and reportedly offered a modest reward for information, but undertook no extensive search, hired no private investigators, and expressed little of the distress one might expect from a suddenly abandoned husband. He continued his business operations with minimal interruption, embarking on a planned trip to New Orleans just 5 days after Clara was last seen. The case might have ended there, recorded as one of countless unexplained disappearances that occurred in an era when record-keeping was inconsistent and travel fraught with dangers both natural and human. But 17 days after Clara vanished, a steamboat worker named Daniel McCarthy discovered a leather document case washed against the pilings at Natchez under the hill, where the rough waterfront district served the river traffic that was the lifeblood of commerce. McCarthy, described in later accounts as a man of unusual conscience for his station, turned the case over to his captain, rather than claiming its contents as salvage. The captain, recognizing the Wainwright name embossed on the leather, delivered it to the local constable's office. The contents, water-damaged but largely intact, included a journal bearing Clara Wainwright's name, along with letters, notes, and what appeared to be the beginnings of a manuscript titled The Hidden Commerce of the Mississippi. These documents would provide the only window into Clara's activities and the dangerous knowledge she had accumulated during her time in Natchez. The journal entries, spanning the previous 3 years, revealed a different Clara Wainwright than the one known to Natchez society. Far from being merely a merchant's wife preoccupied with social calls and household management, Clara appeared to be conducting a methodical investigation into what she termed the shadow trade, operating alongside legitimate commerce on the river. I came to Natchez to confirm what I had begun to suspect in Boston, read one entry dated November 1844. The disappearances are not random, nor are they isolated incidents. There exists a network stretching from northern ports to New Orleans, operating under the very noses of respectable society. They deal not just in goods, but in souls, and not those one might expect in this region. This cryptic reference was clarified in later entries, where Clara documented patterns of disappearances that had first caught her attention while her husband conducted business in Boston. Young women from immigrant families, laborers who had fallen into debt, and others from society's margins were vanishing, with authorities showing little interest in their fates. Clara had noticed similar patterns in other port cities, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, always involving the most vulnerable members of white society. Her suspicions had been aroused when she overheard her husband discussing with a business associate the special arrangements for particular merchandise that commanded premium prices in the Deep South. Initially, Clara appeared to have assumed they were discussing some form of contraband, perhaps European luxury goods avoiding import duties. The realization that the merchandise might be human beings came gradually, documented through a series of increasingly disturbed journal entries. February 3, 1845, she wrote, "Jay received a coded message today regarding a shipment arriving next week on the Magnolia Queen. When I inquired, he spoke of cotton futures, but his manner was evasive. The same steamer brought news of 3 Irish immigrant women who disappeared from the Boston waterfront last month. I can no longer believe these events are unconnected." What Clara had uncovered, according to her journals, was evidence of an underground trade targeting not enslaved persons of color, as might have been expected in that era, but impoverished whites, primarily women and laborers from northern industrial cities and European immigrants who had fallen into extreme circumstances. According to her documentation, these individuals were being transported south through an elaborate network of seemingly legitimate businesses, including Joseph Wainwright's cotton brokerage. "The genius of this operation," she wrote in February 1846, "lies in its invisibility. In a region where the trading of human beings is conducted openly for those of African descent, who would suspect or look for a parallel commerce in whites? The authorities are blind to it precisely because it seems impossible, and because many benefit from its existence." Clara's documentation suggested a system of stunning sophistication. Vulnerable individuals in northern cities, particularly recent immigrants without established community connections, women who had fallen into disrepute, men overwhelmed by debt, would be approached with offers of employment or opportunities in the South. Some were simply abducted from waterfronts or while traveling between cities. They were then transported via steamboat, often concealed in modified cargo compartments, or presented as servants accompanying legitimate passengers. Upon arrival in southern ports, these individuals would be dispersed to various destinations, remote plantations in need of skilled labor, but unwilling to purchase enslaved workers, households requiring domestic servants, establishments in areas like Natchez under the hill that catered to the steamboat trade. Their status existed in a gray area, not legally enslaved, yet not truly free, held through combinations of physical isolation, debt manipulation, and threats. Most insidious, Clara wrote, is the use of debt as a mechanism of control. These individuals are told they owe for their transportation, their lodging, their food, debts structured to be impossible to repay. Some are presented to society as indentured servants working off obligations, others as distant relatives of established families who require supervision due to mental deficiencies or moral failings. The documentation supporting these fictions is extensive and appears legitimate to casual inspection. The most disturbing aspect of Clara's findings wasn't just the existence of this trade, but the complicity of respected members of society throughout the Mississippi River corridor. Her notes included names, dates, and locations, many partially obscured by water damage or written in a personal shorthand that remains undeciphered to this day. Among the legible names were several prominent Natchez businessmen, a New Orleans judge, and at least 2 steamboat captains whose vessels regularly plied the river between St. Louis and the Gulf. Clara had not been content with documentary evidence alone. Her journal described visits to several properties where she suspected victims of this trade were being held. Using her social position and the pretext of charitable interest in the welfare of servants, she had gained access to households where she observed individuals whose appearance, accents, and demeanor suggested Northern or European origins, but who were presented as servants or dependents. Visited the Carson estate today, reads an entry from January 1846. Mrs. Carson proudly showed me her new Scottish maid, acquired through an agency in New Orleans. The woman, Mary by name, spoke with an Irish, not Scottish accent, and showed signs of recent physical correction. When I managed a private word asking if she was well treated, her terror was palpable. She would say only that she was working off her passage and could not speak further. Her wrists bore marks consistent with restraint. Another entry described a more dramatic encounter. At the Wilkinson plantation, observed a man working as a clerk who claimed to be from Amsterdam, but spoke with the distinct accent of Boston's North End. When questioned about his background, he became agitated and was quickly removed from the room by Mr. Wilkinson. Later, as I was leaving, he managed to press a scrap of paper into my hand. It contained only the words, "Help us," and what appeared to be a partially written name, Macant, before being torn. I have added this to my documentation. As Clara's investigation progressed, she began to take greater risks, visiting warehouses near the river landing and attempting to document shipment patterns that might correlate with disappearances reported in northern newspapers. Several journal entries suggest she had identified specific vessels and captains involved in the trade, as well as warehouses where human cargo might be temporarily held before distribution to final destinations. The Magnolia Queen and the River Princess appear most frequently in the pattern, she noted in March 1846, both captained by men with connections to Jay's associates in Boston and Baltimore. The arrivals correlate with transfers of funds through Jay's accounts, though disguised as cotton transactions. The warehouse at the corner of Silver Street and the landing receives special deliveries on these occasions, always after dark, always with the same men supervising the unloading. Clara's final documented investigation took place on April 16th, the day before her disappearance. She described following a wagon from the landing to a property outside Natchez where she observed crates of unusual design being unloaded into a cellar entrance. Her description of these crates, with small air holes and internal restraints, suggests they were designed for human transport. She noted her intention to return to the county courthouse the following day to determine the property's ownership. The journal ends there. What happened after Clara left the courthouse on April 17th remains unknown. The discovery of her document case in the river suggested violence, but could also have been an attempt to destroy evidence. No body was ever found. No witness came forward with information about her final moments, and the official investigation into her disappearance was perfunctory at best. The constable who reviewed the recovered documents, James Harkins, reportedly delivered them to Joseph Wainwright rather than entering them as evidence, a decision that would later be scrutinized when Harkins purchased a substantial property outside Natchez the following year, despite his modest salary. Within days of receiving his wife's documents, Wainwright announced he was closing his Natchez operations and relocating to New Orleans to better manage his business interests in the wake of his personal tragedy. The case might have faded entirely from record had it not been for Dr. William Carpenter, a physician who had treated Clara for a minor illness the previous winter. In September 1846, Carpenter wrote to his colleague, Dr. Thomas Hammond, in Philadelphia, mentioning the peculiar circumstances surrounding Clara's disappearance. This letter, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania archives until 1965, when it was transferred to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, includes a revealing passage. The lady had confided certain suspicions to me during her treatment that I dismissed as fanciful at the time. She believed her husband's business entailed more than cotton and dry goods, and that certain special cargo was being moved through Natchez with the knowledge of authorities. When I inquired as to the nature of this cargo, she became reticent, stating only that she had observed discrepancies in shipping records and had heard sounds from locked warehouse sections that disturbed her greatly. On one occasion, she mentioned seeing a young woman of fair complexion and northern accent working in a plantation household near Port Gibson, wearing a restraint collar typically reserved for rebellious slaves. The woman appeared to recognize Clara and attempted to speak to her, but was quickly removed from the room. Mrs. Wainwright was deeply troubled by this incident and others like it. I regret now that I did not take her concerns more seriously, particularly in light of her unexplained absence. Dr. Carpenter's letter went on to describe how Clara had begun documenting her findings, keeping one journal that she carried with her, and another hidden somewhere in the Wainwright home. This second journal has never been recovered, despite later searches of the property after it passed to new owners in the 1850s. In the months following Clara's disappearance, subtle but significant changes occurred throughout Natchez's commercial district. The Natchez City records from the summer of 1846 note increased patrols near the river landing following unspecified concerns about improper activities, though no direct mention of Clara's allegations appears in official documentation. What does appear, however, is a curious increase in property transactions, several businesses changing hands in quick succession, including warehouses previously associated with Wainwright's operations. Tax records show at least 7 substantial commercial properties changing ownership within a 3-month period, an anomaly that caught the attention of at least one tax assessor, who noted it as unprecedented in my 15 years of service. The pattern suggested a rapid restructuring of business operations, perhaps in response to unwelcome scrutiny. A fire that destroyed a riverfront warehouse in July 1846 was ruled accidental, though the night watchmen reported seeing men removing crates shortly before the blaze erupted. The building, according to property records, had been leased by Thomas Blackwood, a business associate of Joseph Wainwright, frequently mentioned in Clara's journals. Blackwood left Natchez shortly after the fire, reportedly relocating to Texas, though subsequent attempts to locate him there proved unsuccessful. The Silver Dollar Tavern, a notorious establishment in Natchez under the Hill, changed hands 3 times between June and September 1846. The final purchaser, a man named George Sullivan with no previous business history in the area, operated the establishment for less than a year before disappearing, leaving behind substantial debts. Local legend later claimed that Sullivan had been seen in New Orleans, living under a different name and displaying unexpected wealth. A report filed by a Mississippi River patrol boat in August 1846 documents the discovery of an abandoned flatboat near Ellis Cliffs, approximately 12 miles south of Natchez. The vessel contained personal effects of unknown origin and restraints unsuitable for normal cargo. The report was filed but apparently never investigated further. Whether this discovery was connected to Clara's allegations remains speculation, but the timing and location suggest a possible link to the network she had begun to expose. Joseph Wainwright established himself in New Orleans, where city directories list him as a commission merchant with offices near the French Quarter. His business apparently prospered, and by 1850 he had remarried a young woman from a prominent Louisiana family. No further public mention of Clara appears in any records associated with him. However, a New Orleans newspaper from 1852 contains a curious item in its society pages, noting that Joseph Wainwright had abruptly canceled a planned business trip to Boston after receiving a letter whose contents reportedly left him visibly shaken. The leather document case and its contents passed through several hands after being shown to the Natchez constable. Dr. Carpenter claimed to have made copies of certain pages before they were returned to Wainwright, though these copies have never surfaced in any archive. What is known comes primarily from Carpenter's correspondence and later statements. In an 1855 interview with a northern journalist investigating river commerce, Carpenter was more forthcoming about what he had seen in Clara's documents. She had mapped connections between seemingly unrelated businesses, shipping companies, taverns, certain plantations far from the usual routes, a network stretching from Boston to New Orleans. Most disturbing were her accounts of visiting these establishments under various pretexts and observing individuals who appeared to be held against their will, though not through the legal framework of slavery that existed at that time. These were white men and women, primarily of foreign birth or from the lowest classes, who had somehow been transported south and placed in positions of servitude without the protections that even the law afforded to slaves. Carpenter's interview was never published. The journalist's notes were discovered among his effects after his death in 1860, with a notation indicating that publication had been blocked by persons of influence concerned about the inflammatory and speculative nature of the allegations. In December 1850, a New Orleans newspaper reported on the arrest of a man named James Wilson for attempting to sell indenture contracts for 3 women recently arrived from Ireland. The case attracted attention primarily because one of the women managed to speak to a Catholic priest, who alerted authorities. Wilson claimed to be operating a legitimate employment agency, but records found in his possession indicated a network of clients throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. The case disappeared from the papers after Wilson's release on bail, and court records show all charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence. No connection to the Wainwright case was made at the time, though one of the addresses in Wilson's records matched a property previously associated with Joseph Wainwright's New Orleans operations. In 1853, 7 years after Clara's disappearance, a Boston newspaper published a small item noting the discovery of remains along the Mississippi River near St. Francisville, Louisiana. Among the personal effects found with the unidentified deceased was a silver locket containing a miniature portrait. The article noted that the jeweler's mark on the locket matched one known to operate in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. No connection to Clara Wainwright was made at the time, but Dr. Carpenter, who had maintained his interest in the case, wrote to authorities in Louisiana requesting more information. His inquiry apparently went unanswered. The shadows that fell across Natchez in 1846 extended far beyond the immediate case of Clara Wainwright. Her journals had hinted at a vast network operating throughout the Mississippi River Valley, a commerce in human misery that ran parallel to the more visible forms of exploitation that defined the era. While her specific allegations regarding white slavery were never officially investigated, historians have since documented the existence of systems that targeted vulnerable populations of all backgrounds. The practice known as debt peonage would later become more widely recognized as a method of controlling labor through manufactured obligations. Throughout the 19th century, cases emerged of individuals lured by promises of employment, transported to isolated locations, and then informed they had incurred debts for their transportation, room, and board that they must work to repay. These debts were manipulated to ensure they could never be satisfied. While this practice became more associated with the post-Civil War South, Clara's journals suggest it existed in organized form much earlier. What makes Clara's account particularly chilling is not just the nature of the trade she alleged, but the systemic silence that apparently protected it. From courthouse officials to business associates, from riverboat captains to city authorities, her journals suggested a web of complicity that spanned social classes and geographic regions. The respectability of those involved provided the perfect shield against scrutiny or investigation. In 1855, a fire destroyed several buildings on Royal Street in New Orleans, including a boarding house known to house young women seeking employment. In the aftermath, authorities discovered hidden compartments in the walls and floors containing personal effects, including letters, jewelry, and identification papers belonging to at least 12 different women. None of these women were found among the residents or casualties of the fire. The investigation was apparently abandoned after the property owner, a respected businessman with connections to city government, provided documentation showing the building had recently been purchased from its previous owner and was being renovated. The Civil War that erupted in 1861 disrupted the commercial networks of the Mississippi Valley, including whatever remained of the system Clara had begun to document. As Union forces advanced south along the river, many businesses with Confederate sympathies either suspended operations or relocated to areas still under Confederate control. Joseph Wainwright apparently remained in New Orleans throughout the Union occupation of the city, adapting his business to the new circumstances with the flexibility that had characterized his earlier career. During the same period, a fire swept through several buildings in Natchez under the hill. Among the structures destroyed was a former warehouse that, according to property records, had once been leased by one of Wainwright's business associates. During the subsequent clearing of debris, workers reportedly discovered a hidden sublevel containing evidence of human habitation incompatible with legitimate commerce, including restraints attached to wall fixtures and what appeared to be segregated living quarters accessible only through concealed entrances. The city's attention was focused on the greater national conflict, however, and no thorough investigation was conducted. The discovery was noted in a military report, but apparently not pursued further as Union forces prioritized strategic objectives over civilian law enforcement. After the war, as Reconstruction transformed the social and economic landscape of the South, the loose threads of the Wainwright case scattered further. Joseph Wainwright apparently lost much of his fortune during the conflict and faded from public record by 1870. The last mention of him appears in a New Orleans business directory from 1868, listing his occupation simply as merchant with no further details. The networks Clara had begun to document were disrupted by war and its aftermath, their operations either ceasing or adapting to new conditions. In 1868, a former riverboat worker named Thomas Milligan gave an interview to a northern journalist documenting wartime experiences along the Mississippi. In a passage that was ultimately excluded from publication but preserved in the journalist's notes, Milligan described transporting special cargo for certain merchants in the pre-war years. There were crates and trunks we weren't to inspect or discuss. Sometimes sounds came from them that the captain ordered us to ignore. On one voyage from Natchez to New Orleans in '46 or thereabouts, one such crate broke open during loading, and I glimpsed a woman's hand before being ordered away. The captain later said it was a medical specimen bound for New Orleans, but no doctor I knew received goods in such a manner. There were other incidents. Sounds in the night from the hold, passengers who boarded quietly at isolated landings and remained confined to private cabins. One of these passengers, a young woman who appeared drugged or ill, dropped a note as she was being escorted aboard near Vicksburg. I retrieved it later and found it contained only a name, Clara, and the words, "Tell Boston." I didn't know what it meant at the time, and by the time I heard of the Wainwright woman years later, it was too late to make any connection. Milligan's testimony, like so many threads in this dark tapestry, leads to more questions than answers. Was the note a desperate communication from Clara herself, somehow transported upriver after her disappearance? Was it from another woman who had encountered Clara or heard her story? Or was it unrelated coincidence, one of many Claras in the vast geography of the Mississippi Valley, the historical record contains tantalizing fragments that may connect to the Wainwright case, though none provide definitive answers. In 1871, a woman named Mary Sullivan testified before a congressional committee investigating labor conditions during Reconstruction. Sullivan, who identified herself as a former domestic worker, described being transported from Boston to Mississippi in 1844 under false pretenses, then held in conditions of servitude at a remote plantation for over 20 years. She mentioned a visiting lady who had recognized her situation and promised to seek help, but never returned. Sullivan escaped during the chaos of the war and eventually made her way back north. Her testimony was recorded, but no action was taken on her specific allegations, as the committee was primarily concerned with broader policy questions rather than individual cases. The Mississippi River has long been both highway and hiding place, its currents carrying commerce, culture, and countless secrets. Whatever truth lay behind Clara Wainwright's investigations, the river has kept its counsel. The documents she so meticulously gathered were scattered, suppressed, or simply lost to time and indifference. In 1882, a memoir published by a retired riverboat captain included a brief passage recounting an incident in the spring of 1846. "We took on a passenger at Natchez, a lady traveling alone, which was unusual, though not unprecedented. She kept to her cabin during the day, but was observed by the night watchman walking the deck in the small hours, seemingly making notes in a small book. At Baton Rouge, 2 men boarded and inquired about this passenger, presenting themselves as concerned family members. When informed of her habits, they expressed particular interest in her writing. The next morning, the lady was not in her cabin, her belongings were gone, and the men had also departed. Whether they had persuaded her to continue her journey by land, or some other circumstance had occurred, I never learned. It was not my place to investigate passengers' affairs, though in later years I sometimes wondered about her fate." The captain's account provides no names and may be entirely unrelated to Clara Wainwright's disappearance. Yet, the timing, location, and circumstances suggest a possible connection to her story, another piece in a puzzle that remains incomplete after more than a century. In 1905, during renovations to the old Adams County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed compartment within a wall containing a small tin box. Inside was a single sheet of paper, water-stained and fragile, bearing what appeared to be a list of names and dates. At the bottom, barely legible, was written, "Should harm come to me, look to these men and the vessels they command. C.W." The document was turned over to the County Historical Society, but vanished from their collection by 1910. No official investigation followed. A diary found among the effects of a retired schoolteacher in Port Gibson in 1922 contained an intriguing entry from September 1846. Mrs. L. told me a most disturbing tale today about a northern lady who had been making inquiries at various houses along the river earlier this year. According to Mrs. L., this lady was asking questions about new household staff and workers who had appeared recently on certain properties. She showed particular interest in those who seemed out of place or ill-suited to their positions. Mrs. L. believes this lady's subsequent disappearance was not the accident or abandonment reported in the papers, but something more sinister. She claims several households received warnings to report any similar inquiries immediately to certain business associates in Natchez. I do not know what to make of such tales, but Mrs. L. was most insistent that there had been a deliberate effort to silence this northern woman. The schoolteacher's diary, now held in a private collection, has never been authenticated by historians, yet it aligns with other fragments that suggest Clara's investigations extended beyond Natchez itself to the surrounding plantation districts, where some of the individuals she tracked may have been placed in domestic service or field labor. In 1937, as part of the Federal Writers Project, an interviewer recorded the recollections of an elderly man who had worked on Mississippi riverboats before and during the Civil War. Among his many stories of river life was a curious account of hidden compartments built into certain vessels. Some boats had special cabins that didn't appear on any plan. You couldn't access them from the regular passenger areas. They were reached through the cargo hold or through panels in the captain's quarters. These weren't for smuggling goods. They were for passengers who weren't supposed to be seen. Sometimes we'd take on such passengers at night, at landings away from the regular ports. I never knew who they were or why they traveled that way. We were told not to speak of it, and those who asked too many questions didn't last long in river work. The story of Clara Wainwright represents more than just an unsolved disappearance or an unproven conspiracy. It stands as testament to the shadows that often lie behind respectable facades, to the voices silenced for asking uncomfortable questions, and to the histories that powerful interests prefer remain forgotten. In many ways, it is a story about the vulnerability of truth itself, how easily it can be swept away by currents of power, prejudice, and willful ignorance. The Natchez of today bears little resemblance to the river port Clara knew. The grand mansions remain, preserved as monuments to a complex past, while Natchez under the hill has transformed from rough-and-tumble port to tourist attraction. The warehouses that once lined the landing have been replaced or repurposed, their secrets buried beneath progress and time. Yet, echoes remain for those who know where to listen. Local historians occasionally mention the Wainwright mystery as an interesting footnote in the city's past. River workers still tell stories of strange discoveries along the banks, bones, artifacts, inexplicable structures revealed when the water recedes during drought years. In 1958, a historian researching antebellum commerce discovered shipping records in the New Orleans Port Authority archives that contained curious discrepancies. Certain vessels consistently reported lower tonnage on their northbound journeys than when returning south, despite carrying full cargoes in both directions. These same vessels were frequently chartered by a small group of merchants, including Joseph Wainwright during his Natchez period. The historian's notes on these findings were included in a manuscript that was never published, as he accepted a position at another university and apparently abandoned the research. In 1962, an elderly woman claiming to be the granddaughter of Dr. Carpenter donated several items to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, including what she described as papers related to a Northern lady who disappeared. Archivists cataloged the materials, but they were apparently misplaced during a subsequent reorganization of the collection. The donation record remains the only evidence of their existence. A groundskeeper at the Natchez City Cemetery reported in 1970 that an unmarked grave dating to the mid-19th century had been repeatedly decorated with white roses on April 17th each year for as long as he had worked there. The practice ceased after his mention of it attracted attention from local media. No record exists of who was buried in the grave or who might have left the flowers. In 1985, during construction of a new building on the site of a former warehouse near Natchez under the hill, workers uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the original foundation. Inside was a collection of women's personal items, combs, ribbons, a few pieces of jewelry, along with what appeared to be a primitive ledger. Before archaeologists could properly document the site, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the remaining structures and damaged much of what had been found. The incident was ruled accidental, and the construction project eventually continued under new ownership. What happened to Clara Wainwright on that April day in 1846? Did she flee, having discovered her husband's involvement in the very trade she was investigating? Was she silenced by those whose interests were threatened by her inquiries? Or did she meet some other fate entirely unrelated to her research? The fragments that remain offer possibilities, but no certainty. Perhaps she was transported downriver as part of the very trade she sought to expose, her identity erased, and her fate merged with those of the anonymous victims she had tried to document. Perhaps she assumed a new identity, continuing her investigations from the shadows until time or circumstance ended her quest. Perhaps she lies in an unmarked grave somewhere along the great river, her story unfinished, her discoveries unheeded. A letter discovered in a collection of family papers donated to the University of Mississippi in 2001 offers perhaps the most intriguing suggestion of Clara's ultimate fate. Dated 1855 and written by a woman identified only as E.T., possibly Elizabeth Thornton, the friend Clara was supposedly visiting on the day she disappeared, it contains this cryptic passage: "I sometimes wonder if she found what she sought, or if seeking itself was her undoing. Last month in Agneau, I glimpsed a woman who bore a striking resemblance, though changed by years and circumstance. She was boarding a vessel bound for France, accompanied by a gentleman unknown to me. When our eyes met, she showed no recognition, but later a street boy delivered a folded paper containing only the words, 'The river remembers.' Do you? I cannot say with certainty if this encounter was with our lost friend or merely the product of a mind that has dwelled too long on unresolved mysteries. Either way, I have decided it shall be my last journey south. Some questions are perhaps better left unanswered, some doors better left unopened." This tantalizing suggestion that Clara might have escaped, perhaps even fled the country, offers a counterpoint to darker theories about her disappearance, yet it raises as many questions as it answers. If the woman was indeed Clara, why the secrecy? Who was her companion? And what had happened in the intervening years? In the decades that followed, the trade Clara had begun to document would transform, but not disappear entirely. The vulnerabilities she had recognized, poverty, displacement, the power imbalances that allowed some to control the fates of others, remained constants even as their specific expressions changed with the times. The systems that enable exploitation are rarely dismantled completely. More often they adapt and resurface in new forms. Yet Clara's work, fragmentary and incomplete as it remains, represents an early effort to expose such systems, to name the unnameable, to make visible what powerful interests preferred to keep hidden. In this sense, she stands as a forerunner to later generations of investigators, reformers, and ordinary citizens who have risked their safety and security to document injustice. The papers included a letter from Joseph Wainwright dated June 1846, requesting assistance in putting to rest certain unfounded rumors that might damage respectable business interests along the river. The judge's response, preserved as a draft, assured Wainwright that measures have been taken to ensure that the unfortunate speculations of your late wife will not find public credence. Bradford attempted to locate additional correspondence between the two men, but found the relevant. Files had been removed from the collection at some point prior to their donation to the Louisiana Historical Society. In 1965, during research for a book on the history of labor in the American South, historian Margaret Bradford discovered references to the Wainwright case in the personal papers of a New Orleans judge who had served from 1840 to 1860. The most compelling evidence supporting Clara's allegations came to light in 1967, when renovation work on a building in Boston's North End uncovered a hidden chamber containing ledgers dating from the 1840s. The records, maintained by an unnamed shipping agent, documented the transport of special merchandise aboard vessels bound for New Orleans and other southern ports. Each entry included coded notations regarding the merchandise's origin, physical characteristics, and intended destination. While no direct connection to Wainwright was established, several vessels mentioned in the ledgers matched those identified in Clara's journals as part of the trafficking network. The discovery received brief attention in academic circles but little public notice, as the documents disappeared into a private collection before thorough analysis could be completed. In 1980, archaeologist Benjamin Harris conducted an excavation at the site of a former plantation 20 miles southeast of Natchez, where local tradition held that strange goings-on had occurred in the decades before the Civil War. Among his findings were the remains of unusual basement structures described in his field notes as more consistent with confinement than storage, including evidence of restraint fixtures embedded in the walls. Carbon dating placed the structures in the mid-19th century. Harris's preliminary report suggested the possibility that the site had been used to hold people in conditions of captivity, though whether these were enslaved persons or others could not be determined from the physical evidence alone. Funding for the excavation was withdrawn before comprehensive documentation could be completed, and the site was later destroyed during commercial development of the property. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, as scholarly interest in the experiences of women in the antebellum South increased, several researchers attempted to reconstruct Clara Wainwright's life and investigations. Their efforts were consistently hampered by missing records, closed collections, and in at least 2 cases, what appeared to be deliberate interference from descendants of families mentioned in Clara's journals. Professor Emily Thornton of Tulane University, who had been working on a biography of Clara, abandoned the project in 1993 after reporting that her research notes had been stolen from her office and her academic credentials questioned by anonymous communications to university administrators. The next time you stand on the bluffs of Natchez, gazing out over the Mississippi as it winds its way south toward New Orleans, spare a thought for Clara Wainwright. Listen for the whispers that might still carry across the water, the voices of those who sought truth in an age that preferred comfortable lies, and who paid the price for their courage. Some cases are never truly closed, some stories never end, and some truths once buried wait patiently for the right moment to resurface.